Let's talk about the war in Iraq and the buildup to the war in Iraq, which you remember well, and you write extensively about it in the book, In My Time. In August 2002, the invasion took place in March of 2003. You told the veterans of foreign wars.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
That statement was incorrect, right?
But the statement was incorrect.
The statement you made.
It was based on the intelligence that we'd received at the time. It also tracks almost perfectly with what Bill Clinton had said 2 years earlier, based on the same intelligence when he was president.
But you say there was no doubt. There was doubt.
Well, there wasn't at the time. Not at the time. The intelligence we'd received repeatedly since the transition period when we started getting our intelligence briefings, and for 27 months after that, right up till 2003, all showed that he had significant activity underway with respect to weapons of mass destruction. Now, what we found after the war, when we went in with the Iraq Survey Group, was we found there were no stockpiles, but he did in fact have, he preserved and still had the capacity to produce weapons of mass destruction. He had the people, he had the technology, he had the feedstocks, he had the basic capacity to resume production as soon as the sanctions were lifted, and that was in fact his intent. If you go back and you look at statements by David Kay, who chaired the Iraq Survey Group, he said after he finished, he came out and he said, look, I thought there were stockpiles too, but there weren't. But I was even more concerned once I saw what he did have, because it was clear to him that Saddam was gearing up to get back into the business again.
Because if you read the 9/11 Commission report and other reports and all sorts of books, Fiasco, that book, there were those analysts in the U.S. government who had doubts, who had serious doubts at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, at the State Department, at the CIA. There were some analysts who said, we're not so sure about these stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction.
With all due respect, well, I think that's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking. The fact of the matter is, if you go back and you look at 1998, 2 years before we arrived, you had Bill Clinton making public statements that he believed that Saddam Hussein did in fact have weapons of mass destruction and that he would use them unless he was stopped. And based on that, he signed legislation passed by the Congress that made changing the regime in Iraq an object of U.S. foreign policy and appropriated $100 million for that purpose.
But
that was all before we even arrived at the election, 2 years before.
Because I remember interviewing Hans Blix on several occasions. Dr. Mohammed El-Baradei,
right,
the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Hans Blix, the chief weapons inspector of the UN, they expressed doubts all the time. They thought, as you once thought when you were defense secretary in the years that followed, that Saddam had been contained in a box. He represented an enormous threat to his own people, but not to anyone else. You didn't agree with them, did you?
I didn't. I also think there was a little thing called 9/11. That happened.
Did he have any involvement in 9/11?
Listen, hear me out, Wolf. The fact of the matter is, on 9/11, we moved from a situation in which before that we thought about terrorist attacks as law enforcement problems. Somebody blows up a building, we go out, we arrest them, we try them, we put them in jail. On 9/11, when we lost 3,000 people that morning, we decided it wasn't just a law enforcement problem, that it was in fact an act of war. And we had to deal with the possibility of further attacks. Everybody expected there'd be more the morning after 9/11. Nobody would have bet there wouldn't be any for the next 7 years. But we expected there'd be more attacks. We expected there was a very real possibility that it would mount an effort, for example, by al-Qaeda to try to attack us with weapons of mass destruction. We had intelligence that suggested they were pursuing that kind of capability. We had to be focused upon those places in that part of the world where terrorists could get their hands on anthrax or upon some other deadly substance or upon nuclear weapons. And that led us to sit down and take a look, for example, at a country like Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and we concluded based on that that was the place where there was most likely to be this interchange, if you will, between terrorism on the one hand and a rogue state on the other.
But just to be precise, he had no involvement with al-Qaeda and planning or implementing 9/11.
He had no responsibility that we were ever able to confirm for 9/11. We were told right after 9/11, I received a briefing from the CIA provided to me by George Tenet that he had. that he
But that
met.
turned out to be false.
Turned out to be false, but at the time, he supposedly, Mohammed Atta, who was the lead hijacker, had met with one of the senior officials of the Iraqi intelligence service in Prague 5 months before 9/11. That was information provided to us
False
by our
information.
intelligence. Yeah, but you didn't know it was false.
Because
CIA didn't come in and say this
because
is
I
false.
remember talking to
there
him-
were months that went by that they in fact had that very much on their platter. Now, in the final analysis, they were never able to confirm it. But initial reporting was that there had in fact been this cooperation, if you will, between Mohammed Atta and the head of Iraqi intelligence.
But that turned out to be false, incorrect. Because you always said, and I interviewed many times, he's in a box, he's contained, he represents a threat to his own people, no one else. Under this theory, though, after 9/11, that potentially he could represent a huge threat to the United States if he started cooperating with al-Qaeda in a major way. There were other state sponsors of terror that the United States did not go after in a way as it did Saddam Hussein, like Iran, for example. A relationship with terrorists, right?
Correct.
Syria, a relationship with groups you consider terrorists, Hamas, Hezbollah. Why didn't you go after Syria or Iran, just Iraq?
Well, because that was the next one that we were really concerned about. We had, first of all, to deal with Afghanistan because the attacks of 9/11 had been launched out of Afghanistan. Afghanistan had provided a safe haven to bin Laden. He had set up training camps and trained some 20,000 terrorists. Afghanistan came front and center. It was the base of operations from which they launched that attack.
Afghanistan, everybody understands, because they did have a huge al-Qaeda presence.
Right behind Afghanistan was Iraq. And we were convinced, based upon Saddam Hussein's history, based on the fact that he'd started 2 wars, based on the fact that he'd violated 16 out of 17 National Security or UN Security Council resolution, based on the fact that he had produced and used weapons of mass destruction against his own people. There were thousands of dead Kurds because Saddam Hussein had killed them with his WMD. That was the target we had to be focused on if we were going to avoid a situation in which we were going to end up having to deal with a terrorist organization equipped with that deadly capabilities. Now, Saddam had also provided safe haven to terrorists. He was making $25,000 payments to the families of suicide
But
bombers.
a lot of other countries were doing that as well.
Well, not making $25,000 payments. You couldn't go after everybody at once. What we did was we went after the ones, Afghanistan first and then Iraq, that we thought represented the biggest threat to the United States. I think it was the right call.
We're going to have more of the interview coming up, but let's discuss what we just heard from the former vice president. Joining us right now, our chief political analyst, Gloria Borger, and our CNN national security analyst, Peter Bergen. He's written at length about the debunked issue of Iraq's connection to 9/11 in his book, The Longest War. Peter, you're an expert on all of this. Did the former vice president give us the full picture between any intelligence connecting Iraq supposedly and 9/11?
Well, he used an interesting construction, which is we never confirmed that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. I mean, that's kind of a strange thing to say, given the fact that the largest criminal investigation that's ever been conducted in history, they interviewed 160,000 people, they followed up hundreds of thousands of leads, produced absolutely no evidence of any kind of Saddam's links to 9/11. So leaving the idea that somehow there's some possibility that there could have been a confirmation, and also the idea that Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker, had met with an Iraqi intelligence agent was something, it was regarded as so dubious that even when Secretary Powell gave his famous United Nations speech before the war, which was basically an attempt to get the international community to buy into the war, Secretary Powell and his staff excluded that because they thought it was so dubious. And of course now we have in custody the very Iraqi intelligence agent who was supposed to be at that meeting. He denied the meeting. The FBI did an enormously sophisticated timeline on the hijackers and what they were doing. And at the time of the supposed meeting in Prague, Mohammed Atta was actually in Florida based on multiple calls that he made in Florida. His cell phone usage was found. He also made withdrawals from a local bank. He tried to rent an apartment, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I mean, proving negatives is very, very hard. But we have proved, you know, the United States government has proved definitively that there was no link to this between Saddam and 9/11, that there was no meeting with Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker, and the Iraqi intelligence agent, and that was known well before the war.
Yeah, and it's interesting that after the war started in March of 2003, and in the years that followed, even until this day, a lot of Americans believe there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 al-Qaeda hijackers. A lot of us, Gloria, remember your interview with Dick Cheney back in 2004. But what do you make of what he's now saying?
Well, it's interesting because he's moved a little bit. Back in 2004, I interviewed him, actually, Wolf, the day after the 9/11 Commission report came out, which said that there was they had no evidence of a link between al-Qaeda and Iraq, and that they had no evidence to prove that Mohammed Atta had that meeting in Prague. And I remember asking Dick Cheney about it. I said, the 9/11 Commission doesn't have any evidence. Do you have any evidence? And he said, I don't have any evidence one way or another, so I'm still a skeptic. I think the way he's changed, Wolf, in listening to your interview, is that now he clearly is blaming the CIA for providing bad intelligence, and his argument is, look, we're only as good as our intelligence was. But I have to say that Dick Cheney then was the last person standing who seemed to believe that Mohammed Atta had been in Prague that day and met with al-Qaeda.
Met with that Mohammed Atta met with Iraqi intelligence official in Prague. I want to be precise on that, please.
Yes.
Gloria, stand by. We're going to have much more on this. Peter, stand by as well. I want to fact check some more of the interview that's coming up. Much more of the interview with the former vice president here in the Situation Room. Coming up at 25 past the hour. Your questions for Dick Cheney, our followers on Twitter and on Facebook. We asked them what they would want me to ask the former vice president, whether Dick Cheney thinks the cost of the Iraq war was worth it, among other things. Much more of the interview coming up. Also, new details about what you could hear in President Obama's major job speech set for Thursday night before Congress.